We are a very auto-oriented community, but that is changing as we continue to urbanize. We're supposed to surpass Vancouver in terms of population by 2030, so that just gives you some context on the size of the city. And transit ridership is actually growing. That's been a goal for a long time. Cycling use is very low. It's extremely low. It's abysmal. We are the lowest in the region in terms of mode share. And so that's a really important factor for us when we think about reaching our 50% sustainable mode share by 2050. How do we increase cycling? And during the surveys with our updated transportation plan, we do know that 70% of residents do want to cycle more. And so Bikeshare is one of the key quick actions that we're looking at to help change that. So as I mentioned, there's this general idea that people aren't cycling, even the people that do cycle, maybe there's not enough of them. We have made a number of infrastructure investments, particularly in the city center. We do have new design standards, so every time a road is widened, we put in protected cycle tracks, and we have protected intersections at many places in our city center. We got funding during COVID to do a quick build program. There's an example of one of the road space reallocation projects we did. You'll note you don't see somebody on a bike there. And so again, there's this narrative that people aren't using the infrastructure. And so the idea was maybe Bikeshare is one of the final pieces of the puzzle. So if we're urbanizing, we're getting denser, we have the infrastructure, maybe this is what we need to do to get people riding. And from a staff perspective, there was also a risk that if we did this and it wasn't successful, it could really set back our ability to pursue investments into cycling for a long time. So we really wanted to make sure we did it and put everything we could, all hands on deck, into this pilot project. So it initially came up through staff, actually. Bikeshare, I know in other places, scooter share, bike share, micromobility in general, sometimes it's a council initiative, there might be a council champion, or there might be a champion at a senior management level. But this was really at a staff level. We were talking about ideas for the climate strategy back in 2022. And so you can see the second bullet there's just this concept of a pilot in the city center. And over about a year's worth of research and work, we refined our scope to the second bullet point there, specifically e-bikes, not scooters, an expanded operating area, and a time frame to launch. And so I'll talk about how we got from point 1 to point 2. So it really began as kind of a side of the desk piece of work for me. And did what you do with any policy research. You look online, you reach out to people who've done it before. And so I talked to a number of different municipalities, both within BC who had shared micromobility systems or pilots, either underway or that were coming up online, as well as comparable cities like Waterloo and Hamilton in Ontario. We talked to industry because, of course, nowadays it is typically micromobility is driven by private operators, so we want to understand, what makes the system work, what makes it viable, because that's so critical when we go into procurement. We don't want to be onerous to the point where it's just not even going to be feasible. We looked at the contracts, the terms, again, what's reasonable from a city to expect and require. And then another key part of this was visiting and testing systems in different areas. And so I was fortunate to travel a fair amount over the past 2 years for different purposes. And typically when I was visiting a place, I would take some time, try out their scooters, try out the Bikeshare system, and really experience it as a new user to understand what are the pain points and what are the things that we need to be thinking about when we launch their system. So I'll just talk a little bit about some of those observations and how they factored into our policy framework. So parking is one of the most visible issues that cities will face, the idea of curbside management, clutter, devices blocking access and sidewalks. And there's lots of different ways of mitigating this. There's no perfect solution, I'll say. But when Richmond had just launched, I went out there and they had this lock-to requirement. And of course the idea is by locking a device to a bike rack, then you will control where the devices are. And you ended up with a totally different problem. One bike rack that's just overflowing with devices, wasn't even sure if I could park it there or not. Similarly in Chicago, they have a hybrid model where there's docks, but you can also lock the devices to a bike rack in certain areas. And what was happening was that people would lock the bike to itself and they would just leave it in the park. So again, a solution that wasn't actually solving the actual problem. And then of course, Toronto, it's a legacy system, and it's all docked, and I remember riding to Union Station, and you can just see the docks continue along that entire block, and they were entirely full. And so frustrating as a new user, I had to go back 5 blocks and walk back to Union Station. So challenges with docks as well too. And here in Calgary, they had a hybrid system with some designated parking areas. At least in this particular instance, everything was quite orderly. And that's kind of what we ended up doing in Surrey, which I'll speak to a little bit later. Tech is also used or promoted by operators as a means of mitigating concerns. There's lots of perceived issues of folks on devices having conflicts with pedestrians and sidewalks. So the idea is that the device will know when you're on a sidewalk, and in this instance I was riding along a cycle track in Ottawa, and the device was saying, hey, you're on a sidewalk, you gotta stop, the device is not gonna move anymore, tried to park it, couldn't park it, the GPS wasn't working. So again, just a very frustrating experience, especially when you're being charged per minute. Similarly with no ride zones. I took a scooter in San Francisco. I was down at Fisherman's Wharf with a few friends. We were down on the Embarcadero where there's a protected bike lane. We thought, hey, let's go to the Golden Gate Bridge, right? And while we're on the bike lane, everything's fine. Suddenly hit Golden Gate Park and no ride zones everywhere. The devices are beeping. They're saying you can't go here. And what was really frustrating is that a private e-bike, a private scooter can go through these areas, but the shared devices couldn't. And there was no signage on where you were supposed to go. And there was no infrastructure on the roads that you were being detoured on. And so just all those sticking points really were quite frustrating. And again, things that we factored into how we planned our system later on. Really great experience in Toronto though, and it reminded me of the importance of getting all those pieces to create legible and comfortable infrastructure. So this was when I was near Distillery District down near the waterfront. And over the past number of years, Toronto has been making a lot of investment in adding protected bike lanes throughout their downtown core, and they have a pretty solid network now that's emerging. And along Esplanade and Mill Street, they have implemented a two-way bike lane here, protected facility, and just really comfortable infrastructure on a local street, not a lot of traffic, very easy to navigate. They had great wayfinding, they had bike share stations along the route. Of course, there's destinations along the route, and so all those pieces are really coming together to create a wonderful experience. And for me, this was really an example of what we should be striving for in all of our cities. And then just a final note here in terms of observations. These are all pictures from Toronto, and they say kids are an indicator species. If you build something for kids, it's good for everybody, and that was really a good testament to the work that Toronto's been doing with the downtown protected bike lanes, which you would see kids all over the place. So what about scooters, and why did we decide not to do scooters at this time? So, I think our senior management takes direction from larger cities to some degree, and the fact that at the time that we were pursuing this, that scooters remained illegal in Toronto and Montreal was a really big consideration, as well as BC's decision, or the provincial government's decision to extend the pilot for another 4 years. I think that sent a bit of a message that there's still some concerns to work out, and just didn't give senior management confidence that everything had been ironed out with scooters. And so that was a challenge. And then I think the other factor for us in Surrey, at least, is that at a staff level, we have very limited opportunities to engage directly with council. And so we didn't have a chance to really have an open dialogue and do a pulse check with where they stood on scooters. So what we ended up with in terms of our initial policy framework that went to the RFP process was our expanded operating area, so not just city center, but Guildford, so our 2 largest and most urban town centers in the city. We ensured that it was connecting to key destinations like Guildford Mall, Central City Mall, as well as our major parks like Green Timbers. This was also where we had the most protected cycling infrastructure built to date. There was a few key gaps, but we felt a lot more comfortable with people using the system here than in other parts of the city. Up to 300 e-bikes, that was based on ratios from other cities, comparable cities. we required designated parking areas, and we spaced them out typically every 200 to 400 meters. We do have a rough grid network in Surrey, and so the idea was to make it very legible and consistent. We would have designated parking areas at every major and minor intersection, so you can walk, 2 minutes and you're going to hit a bike share area. We also had limited restrictions on the tech, so the idea was, let's see where people want to go. If there's issues, we'll implement speed restrictions, but we don't want to be overly onerous in terms of the riding restrictions that I had experienced in other cities. The contract, we wanted to remain fairly flexible. We wanted to incentivize certain behavior and not be prescriptive. And then another key component in Surrey, at least, is that as a city, we have pretty lean operations, and we rely very heavily on partnerships with other agencies and stakeholders within the community. And so factoring that into the contract and ensuring that we had a partner that was really at the table to engage with those community stakeholders and tap into the markets that they work with was really important for us. And so I said at the beginning that this was a bit of a make or break for Surrey and cycling. And so for us, it wasn't enough just to have a strong partner at the table, but we needed to do everything we could as a city to make sure that that this project was successful. And so during the phases between policy research up to launch, there's a number of supportive city investments that we cobbled together really quickly, oftentimes with existing resources and unidentified projects. And there's a number of them here. So we developed our first ever bike counter program. There was a bunch of loop counters that had been installed and never turned on that nobody realized. So we activated those. We did myovision count across the city to establish a baseline of bike usage on all of our major corridors. We implemented the city's first ever comprehensive wayfinding system. So that picture there on the right is based on TransLink's 2013 wayfinding guidelines, and so we identified a primary network along the bike share area and installed 60 signs that give you turn-by-turn directions on the safest routes to get to these major destinations. We delivered the first ever local bikeway in Surrey in the past 10 years, so we haven't done these for a very long time, but we used pavement markings and signage to connect city center and Guildford because there was a gap in our protected cycling network, and we wouldn't be able to actually deliver the capital projects in time for launch. And so we did this local bikeway, and it's actually been really popular. People feel quite comfortable using it, and they actually prefer it compared to some of our cycle track routes. And then we also took a look at our capital plan, and we were able to rejig it, deprioritize some projects that were in the queue, bring up ones that were in this operating area. And even though it is kind of a 3-year cycle, we have prioritized some projects that we're hoping to get delivered next year. And that's them right there, all those red lines. So thanks to TransLink cost sharing programs, we've gotten funding for all of these. They're in design. Some of them will be delivered this summer, and some of them will be delivered next year, and complete a protected grid within this operating area. So just a summary of our project timeline. So the research really began at 2022. We had some internal staff engagement based on initial policy directions, where we had some key decisions that we made together as a transportation team and collaborated with parks and some other agencies within the city. That went to our GM, which then went to our senior management team. And as I mentioned before, there was no council engagement on this initiative. There was no direct communication. There was no corporate reports. They did not sign off on anything. This was all at the staff level. So we went into procurement at the end of summer. We had a lot of buffer time from our launch date, and we ended up eating up all that buffer time. But we did make launch. We signed a contract with Burbs as the exclusive operator for the 2-year pilot project at the beginning of April, and then we launched the pilot at the end of April. So we had kind of a 2-phase approach. We had a soft launch on April 24th. That's the picture there with the April showers, and we had some of our key stakeholders there to try out the bikes, see how the tech worked. We had Discover Surrey, which is our tourism board. We had Fraser Health, we had SFU. They were all really excited and interested and keen on working together to provide information to some of their key target markets. And then we had our public launch at Party for the Planet, which is Surrey's annual Earth Day Festival. It's the largest in Western Canada, and a lot of people had heard about the bikes or they had seen the bikes, and that was a great opportunity just to engage them face to face and explain how it works, what's the pricing, how do you download the app, how do you do the QR code. Because even though they do exist all over the place, it's still new for Surrey, right? And of course we track reaction. This is just some screenshots of social media. Social media isn't everything. Some Facebook and Reddit posts here, but here's some of the positive feedback. I like the one on the far right where it basically says they missed a bus connection and they ended up using the bike and they found it really useful. And then of course the trolls. There's negative feedback for everything online. But there's always a nugget of truth in some of this, and we monitor it. The other thing, of course, we monitor is the actual service requests we get directly to the city, and we are very fortunate that we've only received 8 over the first month of operation. So that, for us, compared to other launches in other cities, that's quite low, and so we're really proud of that.